In this one, we're going to finish up event management. We're then going to implement all the endpoints needed to drive 2 new pages, and that includes implementing text search using Postgres. This is part 8 of the event ticket platform build. There is over 6 hours of free content on this build right here on YouTube. So if you haven't seen parts 1 through 7 yet, I'll link to those below. Although if you're just interested in how I implemented text search using Postgres in the Spring Boot app, or anything that I've just listed, then you can stick around for that and treat this as a standalone video. All of the resources that I use in this video, including the Spring Boot backend source code and the React frontend source code, you can download for free from the Devtiro Discord server. I'll put a link in the description below so you too can join the community. Okay, with all that covered, let's get started. In this module, we'll implement the delete event endpoint. The module is structured like this. We'll start by implementing the delete event service layer. We'll then implement the delete event controller endpoint before testing the delete functionality in the user interface. So now for the learning objectives. So by the end of this module, you'll be able to implement the delete event service layer, implement the delete event endpoint in the presentation layer, and test the delete endpoint in the user interface. So with this covered, let's get started. In this lesson, we'll implement the delete event functionality in our service layer. So back in our IDE, let's head over to the event service here, and we're going to add a new method. Let's minimize that so we can see. This one is going to return void, nothing at all. And we'll call this one delete event for organizer, passing in the UUID representing the organizer ID and also the ID of the event. So we'll copy that and paste that in there. So the implementation of this method is only going to delete the event if the organizer has access to it. So that's to say, if the ID here represents the user that organized the event, only then does this implementation allow for the event's deletion. So let's head to the implementing class here, hover over the red squiggle, implement methods, okay, and we now have our method stub ready to implement. We're going to be making a few calls to the database in this one, so let's put @transactional on the top here so we don't forget. So let's start by calling the event repository and actually, no, let's not call the event repository because if we scroll up here, we should already have a method which, if we minimize the update, here we are. We have this get event for organizer method, which will, yes, call the repository, but let's use this as a layer of abstraction. So we'll call get event for organizer, passing in the organizer ID and also the ID of the event that we want to delete. And we'll call on this, if present, we're going to call event repository delete. I think it's just delete. Yes, it is, because we are returning an event from here and we don't need to return anything. So this is the whole implementation of this method. Now note that this method is not going to throw an exception if, for example, the organizer doesn't have access to the event. And perhaps that's something we may want to add in future. For the minute, it's a very simple implementation, which is simply going to return void. And if the event exists and the user has access to it, it will delete it from the database. In summary, we added the delete event for organizer method to the service layer. In this lesson, we'll implement the delete event endpoint on our controller. So we've just implemented delete events for organizer. So let's go over to our event controller and look to use it. So if we scroll down to the bottom here, I'm going to add a new method here. This one is going to use a delete mapping, and the path is going to be / and embraces event ID. This one's going to return a response entity of type void, and we'll call this one delete event. We are going to need the authentication principal and the path variable, so I'm going to copy those from our get event function. There we go. So we don't need to do any mapping in this one. We can simply call the event service dot delete event for organizer. We will need the organizer ID, so I am going to use the call to our private method here. So we'll pass in the user ID and then the event ID, and then we'll return a response entity dot no content dot build. And with that, we have an initial implementation of our delete event endpoint. So in summary, we implemented the delete event endpoint. In this lesson, we're going to test our delete event endpoint by using the user interface. So here we are in our IDE. We're going to start here by running clean and compile to make sure we don't have any issues with mapstruct or lombok. Very good, we have a build success. So let's now run our application. Very good, so that's our application started up fine. So let's head over to our browser. So here we are in our browser on the list events page. So we have some events here. We've got some test data on a second page, some more test data. So let's go about deleting test event 5 as our test, I think. So let's open up our network panel so we can see what's going on. And down here on the bottom right of the card, we have this delete button, which is new. If we click on it, we get this prompt. Are you absolutely sure you want to delete test event 5? If I'm not sure, I can click on cancel and nothing happens. But if I am sure, I click on continue. And if we look here, we get a HTTP 204 back from this delete call to API v1 events and then the ID of the event here. Now, the page has refreshed. We're on page 2 and there's currently no records on there because we have test event 3, test event 4. So it looks like test event 5 has been deleted successfully and our delete event endpoint is working as expected. So in summary, we tested the delete event functionality works in the front end. So let's recall what we've achieved in the delete event module. In delete event service, we added the delete event for organizer method to the service layer. In delete event endpoint, we implemented the delete event endpoint. And in UI testing, we tested the delete event functionality works in the front end. In this module, we'll implement the list published events endpoint. We'll use this endpoint to populate the attendee landing page. The module is structured as follows. We'll first implement the list publish events service layer, then the DTOs and mappers. Then we'll implement the REST API endpoint, and then we'll test the endpoint using the user interface. So now for the learning objectives. So by the end of this module, you will be able to implement the list publish events service layer, implement the DTOs and mappers required for the list publish events endpoint, implement the list publish event endpoint in the presentation layer, and test the list publish event endpoint in the user interface. So with this covered, let's get started. In this lesson, we'll implement the list publish events service layer. So here we are back in our IDE. Now we're going to be returning published events. And as we're still dealing with events here, it makes sense for us to update the event service. So let's go to the event service here. And we're going to add a new method to this one. And this is going to return a page of event. And we'll call this one list published events. It's going to take a pageable, which we'll call pageable. Very good. Now, if we go down to the implementation, hover over here, go implement methods. Okay. We now have this method stub ready to implement. Now we're going to need some sort of way to get published events from the database. So that to me sounds like a custom method on our event repository. So if we go to the event repository, we're going to add a new method here. And this is going to return a page of event. And we'll call this one find by status, where the first argument is going to be the event status enum, which we'll call status. So that's the status to filter by or to search by. And then we have the pageable object, pageable, like so. So now that we have find by status, we're going to take this, go to our implementation, scroll down to the bottom here, and then we can call event repository dot find by status. The status we're going to use in this case is going to be published, and we can pass in the pageable object. And if we return, this will return a page of all published events in our application. In summary, we added the find by status method to the event repository interface. We added the list published events method to the event service interface. And we implemented the list published events method in the event service import class. In this lesson, we'll implement the DTOs and mappers that we'll need to implement the list published events endpoint. So let's start with the DTO. So if we go to our domain here, go to the DTOs package, and we're going to follow the naming convention. And this is going to be the response DTO from the list published events endpoint. So we'll say new Java class, list published event response DTO. There we go. And we'll say data, all as constructor, no as constructor. So here's what we're going to do. Let's open up the list event response DTO and let's split this on the right. And then we can close project and we can open up our new list published events response DTO. The list published event response DTO is going to be a subset of the list event response DTO. So what that means in practice is that this new DTO is going to have the ID, the name, the start, end, and the venue, but that's it. So we copy that, paste that across. This is all we need to include in this particular response. And you might be asking why that is. Well, this is all the information that we need in order to display the cards on the attendee landing page. We don't need to include any more information at this point, so that's what we'll include. So let's copy this name here. And if we go to our project, go down to the mappers here, open up Event Mapper, let's close what we don't need. And we're going to add a new method to this. It's going to return our list published event response DTO. We'll call it to list published event response DTO, passing in the event. And that's all we need to do for mapping. Because we've used all of the same instance variable names, map structs can work everything else out. So with that, we've created our DTO and we've created a mapper that will allow us to convert an event into the DTO. In summary, we created the list published event response DTO class, and we added the toList published event response DTO method to the event mapper interface. In this lesson, we'll implement the list published event endpoint. So here we are back in our IDE. Now, although we are dealing with events in our service layer, I'm going to suggest that at the presentation layer, we should treat the published event as its own thing. So with that in mind, I'm going to create a new controller, and I'm going to call this one published event controller. And if we minimize that, now to the top of this class, we're going to put the @REST controller annotation, marking this as a REST controller. And then for the request mapping, we're going to specify the path of /API /v1 published -events. So now for the list published events method, we'll do a get mapping, public, returning a response entity, which is going to include a page of the published event list of, here it is, list published event response DTO. And we'll call this one list published events. And it's going to take a pageable as an argument there. We'll call that one pageable. And now we can implement this method. So we're going to need the event service in this one. So let's do required args constructor, which will allow us to create a constructor easily from a private final event service, which we'll call event service. And of course, we'll also need the event mapper. So we'll say event mapper, calling that one event mapper. Now, let's say event service dot list published events, passing in our pageable object. We'll now need to map this, and we'll call our event mapper to list published event response DTO. Let's put that on a new line. And we're going to wrap this in a response.ok like so. And that will return a HTTP 200 where it's a paginated list of our published events. But that's not all, because we said this was going to be a public endpoint. And at the moment, we're in that catch-all configuration in Spring Security, which will require us to provide an access token in order to hit this endpoint. So let's change that. So if we go over to the config directory here, security config, and then we'll close project, and we're looking for this block here. So we currently have a catch-all rule in there. In fact, if we just do some new lines, we're going to move this comment down, because technically speaking, that's the catch-all rule. And above that, we're going to specify our new endpoint. So we'll say request matches. It's going to be a HTTP GET method. And we're going to be very specific. So we're going to say to /API v1 / published events. And we're going to say permit all. So all GET calls to API v1 published events are going to be allowed through, but everything else is still going to require authentication, essentially making this endpoint public. And with that, we should have our new endpoint ready to use. In summary, we created the published event controller class. We implemented the list published events endpoint, and we made the list published events endpoint public. Let's now test our new endpoint by using the user interface. So we'll start off back in our IDE. We're going to call clean and compile. Let's run this. Build success, so everything's in order. So let's now run our application. Great, that's the application started up fine. So let's head over to the user interface in our browser. All right, so we are on localhost 5173 /. So this is our attendee landing page. So it's changed ever so slightly. It's not completely refined and ready for production, but what it does show is that we have this hero image up here, the ability to log in. We're currently not logged in, and we can see test event 3 and test event 4, which if we do log in with our organizer user, we can see on the organizers list event page, test event 3 and test event 4. But if we log out here, We can see that we're able to get these without being logged in. So if we go to our networks panel, let's filter by all calls to API, refresh the page. There we go. We can see that we're getting HTTP 200 back from our new endpoint, API v1 published events. And we want the first event and we want the first 4. In this case, we only have 2, so only 2 cards are displayed. Now you might be wondering about the images. Well, the images are actually random. We haven't implemented the infrastructure to upload and manage images. But to kind of complete the look, make it look a bit better, we have these random images in play. But everything else is from our published event. The name, we have the venue details and the date as well. So with that, it looks like our list published events endpoint is working as expected. In summary, we tested the list published events endpoint works by using the user interface. So let's recall what we've achieved in the list publish events module. In list publish events service, we added the find by status method to the event repository interface, and we added the list publish events method to the event service interface, and we implemented the list publish events method in the event service import class. In DTOs and Mappers, we created the list publish event response DTO class, and we added the toListPublishEvent event response DTO method to the event mapper interface. In list publish event endpoint, we created the published event controller class, and we implemented the list publish events endpoint. In UI testing, we tested the list publish events endpoint works by using the user interface. In this module, we'll implement the published event search functionality. The module is structured like this. We'll start by implementing the search functionality in the service layer. We'll then update the controller to handle search requests, and then we'll test the search functionality through the user interface. So for the learning objectives, by the end of this module, you'll be able to implement the published event search functionality in the service layer, update the published event controller to support optional searching, and test the search published event functionality by using the user interface. So with this covered, let's get started. In this lesson, we'll implement the published event search functionality in the service layer. So we're back in our IDE, let's head over to the services package, we'll go to event service, and we're going to introduce a new method here. This is going to return a page of events, much like our list publish events, but we're going to call this one search published events. It's going to take a string query and a pageable, which we'll call pageable. So with this added, let's go down to the implementation, hover over the red squiggle, go implement methods, okay, and now we have our method stub. So where this differs, let's actually close out so we can see. So where this differs from our list publish events is this is going to just list out all published events, whereas this one is going to list out only the events which match the query. And we're going to allow the user to query using terms from the event name, the venue name, and more can be added as and when requirements dictate. So how are we going to do this? Well, we're going to have to implement some search functionality. Now we could use a full-blown search technology like Elasticsearch, but in this case, we're going to leverage PostgreSQL's text search abilities. So to do this, we're going to go to the event repository and we'll introduce a new method. This is going to return a page of event, and we're going to call this one search events. It's going to take a parameter, which we'll call search term, string search term, and of course we'll need that pageable as well. Now this is one of those instances where Spring Data JPA isn't going to be able to work out the particular query that we want. So we're going to use the query annotation here, and then we're going to specify a string value to the query annotation. Now this query is a bit complicated, so I'll put this in the lesson notes rather than type it all out, but we will go through it after we have it. So here we are. Now it is worth noting that this query is very specific to PostgreSQL. So we're using PostgreSQL functions here in order to search for the search term, which we can see highlighted here, in 2 different places. We're searching in the name field and also the venue field. Both of these are, if we bring up the event actually, name and venue are both string fields. So we're able to do a text search on these fields. Let's go back. This query also supports pagination via the pageable here. And I will point out this part here. So it filters to only return published status events. So it might look quite complicated, but at a high level, we're searching on the name and venue fields using text search, we're supporting pagination, and we are only returning published events. So now that we have this search event method, we can go ahead and use it in our service layer. So back to event service impl here. Let's scroll down to the function we're implementing. Here we are. And we're simply going to do a pass through. So event repository dot search events, passing in the query as the search term, and then we'll pass in our pageable object as well. So let's return this. And with that, we've implemented the search published events functionality in our service layer. In summary, we added the search events custom query to the event repository interface. We added the search publish events method to the event service interface. And we implemented the search publish events method in the event service impl class. In this lesson, we'll update the published events controller to support search. So back in our IDE, we have here our published event controller. So let's scroll down to its one method, list publish events. So we're going to add search functionality to this particular endpoint. So when the user specifies a query, we search, otherwise we list. We could potentially have a separate endpoint for this. However, as it only differs by a query parameter, we'll use the same endpoint. So let's introduce this query parameter then. So we're going to say at request param, like so. And we'll say required is false. This is optional. And we'll say it's the string of Q. So Q is a bit of a convention that you'll see on search endpoints, and it's short for query. So we have a nice, concise, functional approach here, but I think for the sake of making everything clear, we're going to do this in a slightly simpler way. So let's say we're going to have a page of events. We'll call this one events, like so. And now we're going to do an if statement. So if Q is not null, and we'll say Q.trim.is empty, and then we'll put an exclamation mark at the front here. So if Q is not null and Q is not empty when we trim it, then we're going to say events equals event service dot search published events, passing in our query Q and then our pageable object. Otherwise, events is going to be event service dot list published events, passing in our pageable object. So we now have events. So we're going to pass in events here, like so, and we're going to return a response entity OK after converting all of our events into a DTO. So in summary, if the query is provided, then we're going to search. If the query is not provided, because it is in fact optional, then we're just going to list all the published events. We're going to map the published events to a DTO, which is the list published event response DTO, and then we're going to return a HTTP 200. And with that, we've added search functionality to the list published events endpoint. In summary, we added the search publish events endpoint to the published events controller. In this lesson, we'll test the published event search functionality by using the user interface. So we're back in our IDE. We're going to run clean and compile. There we go, the application started up fine, so let's head over to the front end. So here we are in the front end, and we can see here test event 3 and test event 4, which is our two test published events. So let's see what we can do for testing on this. So let's inspect, go to our networks tab here, pull that down, and let's try this out. So let's first search for just the word test, because the word test should appear in both of these. So we'll go with test, and let's click on search. We still have 2. Test was sent, 200 OK, and our response is the 2 events. Very good. Now let's go with test event 3, and we'll search for this. We only get back test event 3, test event 4, we get test event 4 back. Very good. Okay, let's delete that, and let's click on search again, and we get both of them back. So let's now search for the word details, which appears in this venue details, but not in this one. So we'll search for details, expecting test event 3. Very good. So although it's fairly basic search functionality, it looks like our search events functionality is working as expected. In summary, we tested the search event functionality using the user interface. So let's recall what we've achieved in the published events search module. In search service layer, we added the search events custom query to the event repository interface, and added the search published events method to the event service interface, and implemented the search published events method in the event service import class. In search controller updates, we added the search published events endpoint to the published events controller. And in UI testing, we tested the search event functionality using the user interface. In this module, we'll implement the get published event details endpoint, and we'll use this data to populate the published event page, where a user can view details of an event and eventually purchase tickets to that event. So now for the module structure. We'll first implement the get published event functionality in the service layer. We'll then implement the DTOs and mappers. We'll implement the get published event details endpoint, and then we'll test the functionality through the user interface. So now for the learning objectives. By the end of this module, you will be able to implement the service layer functionality to get a published event, implement the DTOs and mappers needed to implement the get published event endpoint in the presentation layer, and implement the get published event endpoint in the presentation layer. And finally, test the get published event functionality by using the user interface. So with this covered, let's get started. In this lesson, we'll implement the get published event service layer. So here we are back in our IDE. Let's head over to the event service here, and we're going to introduce a new method. This one's going to return an optional of event, and we'll call this one get published event, and it's simply going to take one argument, a UUID, which represents the event ID. If we go down to the implementation now, hover over here, implement methods, okay. We now have this method stub ready to implement. Now we're going to need some way of getting a event by its ID, but only if it's in published status. So in order to do that, let's create a new custom method or custom query inside of our event repository. Let's minimize that so we can see. So this one's going to return an optional of event, and we'll call this one find by ID and status. And we can make use of Spring Data JPA's naming conventions for this one, providing we pass in the ID, a UUID, and then an event status enum, which we'll call status. Now we can use this inside of the implementation, which we scroll down here, should be a call to event repository dot find by ID and status, passing in the ID, and then making sure the event status is set to published. And let's return this. And with that, we've implemented the get published event service layer. In summary, we added the find by ID and status method to the event repository. We added the get published event method to the event service interface, and we implemented the get published event method in the event service import class. In this lesson, we'll implement the DTOs and mappers that we need to implement the get published event endpoint in the presentation layer. So back in our IDE, let's go over to the domain package here into DTOs, and we're going to take a look at the get event details response DTO. So the DTO that we are to create, which will be get published event details response DTO, will be a subset of this particular class. So what we'll do is we'll copy this, calling the pasted class get published event details response DTO. A long name, but very descriptive. And in the pasted class, we're going to decide what we want to include. ID, yes. Name, yes. The start and the end time of the event, yes, let's include that. The venue details, absolutely. The sales start and sales end, no, let's not include this because the attendee only wants to know whether or not they can buy the tickets. They don't necessarily want to know the window they can buy them in. The same for status. Let's exclude this because all of the events will be published. And let's exclude updated at and created at. The attendee user doesn't want to know about that. Now, we will include the ticket types and we will need a different DTO for this one. So let's go here, identify where it is. Here we are, get event details ticket type. The name will get longer when we paste it. We have here get published event details ticket types response DTO. And we'll include the ID, name, price, description. Will not include total available, created at, or updated at, because the attendee user doesn't want to know about any of that. So let's copy the name of this DTO. We'll go back to our get publish event details response DTO and make sure that ticket types uses this as a type. So that's our DTO. Let's now go over to the mappers class and we can deal with the mappers next. Here we are. Let's expand this. So let's return this, and we'll say to get published event details response DTO, passing in the event. But of course, we'll also need to handle the get published event details ticket types response DTO. So let's paste that there, and we'll say to name of that class, passing in the ticket type, which we'll call ticket type. And now this particular method can be used by mapstruct in this one here. So with that, we have both our DTOs and our mapper methods ready to use. In summary, we added the get published event details response DTO and the get published event details ticket types response DTO classes. And we added the mapper methods. In this lesson, we'll implement the get published event endpoint. So back in our IDE, we have the published event controller class open. So let's get to implementing our new endpoint. So we already have an endpoint which lists and searches for the published events. Let's introduce a new one to get the published event. So this one will also be a get mapping, but this one's going to specify a path. And in that path, we're going to specify the event ID, public response entity, returning our new DTO, which is the get published event details response DTO. And we'll call this one get published event details. And in the arguments, we're going to specify a path variable. It's going to be a UUID, and we'll call this one event ID. Let's import UUID here. Great. Now for the implementation of this method. Let's just remove that trailing comma. So we're going to call the event service dot get published event, passing in the event ID, and then we'll call .map, because if we find the event ID, we'll want to call the event mapper to get published event details response DTO, and then we'll call map again, because we'll want to return a response entity, OK, or else we're going to want to return a response entity not found, build. And if we return this from our method now, but that's not all. We'll want to make sure that this is a public endpoint. So let's go over to the security config here. Config, security config, expand this. And we've been very specific so far. We said the get call to API v1 published events. Well, I'm going to put a / and then 2 asterisks after that as a wildcard. So this should also match when we specify the ID as well for our get published event details. So with that done, we've implemented the get published event details endpoint. In summary, we implemented the get published event endpoint, and we updated security config to make calls to the make get published event endpoint public. In this lesson, we'll test the get published event endpoint by using the user interface. So back in our IDE, let's open up Maven here and run clean and compile. Great, we have a build success, so let's run our backend application. Okay, that's the application started up fine, so let's head over to the user interface. Okay, so here we are on the attendee landing page, test event 3 and test event 4. So let's click on test event 3 here. Okay, great. So we can see here we have the published event details page. And let's take a look at the network call that we've got here. So we can see HTTP 200 OK, made to API v1 published events, and then the ID of the event. And there's no authorization header. So we've been able to implement this endpoint and make it public. And in the response, we have the event details and our various ticket types. So let's take a look at the information on the page. Name of the event, venue details, dates of the event, a random image, and then we have the various different ticket types. VIP entry, platinum entry, standard entry, and then the different prices, and then the ability to purchase tickets. But of course, we've yet to implement this. So all of this information matches if we log in now. Organizer password. Here we are, test event 3. We can see here the various information, test event 3, the dates, test event details 3, and then the ticket types, VIP entry, platinum entry, and standard entry. So it looks like our get published event details endpoint is working as expected. In summary, we tested the get published event details endpoint through the user interface. So let's recall what we've achieved in the get published event module. In service layer, we added the find by ID and status method to the event repository, and added the get published event method to the event service interface, and implemented the get published event method in the event service import class. In DTOs and Mappers, we added the get published event details response DTO and get published event details ticket types response DTO classes, and added these classes corresponding mapper methods. In getPublishedEvent endpoint, we implemented the getPublishedEvent endpoint and updated the security config to make call to this endpoint public. In UI testing, we tested the getPublishedEvent endpoint through the user interface. Alright, we now have a button to purchase tickets. Look forward to next time when we start to implement this functionality. As a reminder, if you want access to the community and all the resources I've used here for free, then there's a link in the description below. Now, if you look up here, you should see the next video in the series, and if you don't see it, it means it's not out yet. So I'd recommend subscribing to be notified when it does come out, and in the meantime, why not check this out?